Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Watching Booksellers podcast, where we bring you conversations from our bookstore's vast community of book professionals who talk about what they do for the love of books. Thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine. I'm here with my co-producer, Marnie. Hey, Marnie.
Hi there.
And this week, we are sharing a recording of a wonderful talk that was at the Montclair Literary Festival with Colm Tóibín and Garth Risk Hallberg.
Colm Tóibín, who has written many highly acclaimed novels, including Brooklyn and Long Island, was here to launch his latest book of short stories, The News from Dublin. Local author and podcast guest, Garth Risk Hallberg, moderated this very interesting and funny talk.
Before we play the event for you, Marnie, do you have any books you want to recommend?
Sure. I'm rereading a nonfiction book called This Is Chance by John Mooallem, and it's about one of the largest earthquakes in American history in Alaska in 1964. It's a very, very good book. Definitely recommend it, and you can get it at the store. How about you? What are you reading?
I'm reading The Foursome by Christina Baker Klein. It's the book she just put out. It is a fictionalized version of Aang and Chang. Do you remember that book that came out 20 years ago? And it's about the two women who were sisters who married them. And particularly one of the sisters who she sort of went along with it. She wasn't as much interested in marrying them. But it's really fascinating because, it goes into detail. Like they made 21 children between the two families. Yeah. So it's a pretty interesting story and definitely a fun read.
Okay, let's introduce the authors. Colm Tóibín is the author of 11 novels, including Long Island, and Oprah's book club pick, The Magician, winner of the Rathbones Folio Prize, The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, and Nora Webster, winner of the Hawthornden Prize, as well as 3 story collections and several books of criticism. He is the Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of Humanities at Columbia University and was named the 2022-2024 Laureate for Irish Fiction by Arts Council of Ireland. In 2021, he was awarded the David Cohen Prize for Literature.
And moderating the talk is Garth Risk Hallberg. His first novel, City on Fire, was a New York Times and international bestseller and was selected as one of the best books of 2015 by the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and Vogue. It was the basis for the Apple TV series of the same name. His second novel, The Second Coming, is about a troubled teenage girl and her recovering addict father. It was published in 2024 and is in paperback now. He is also the author of the novella A Field Guide to the North American Family, and in 2017, Granta named him one of the best young American novelists. His work has been translated into 17 languages.
Enjoy the talk, and we'll be back after to fill you in on what's coming up in the store.
But I think of you, wrongly, as a novelist. I think that's probably the way most of us have access to your work, but then I turn to this and I see poetry and essays and all these things. And now your third book of short stories. What does the short story offer you as a writer that the ampler form of the novel doesn't? You're so good at giving us, whole lives and histories. What draws you to this kind of more constrained space?
I started as a poet, as a 12-year-old poet, and I took myself very seriously. And I already had titles for books and all sorts of things. And I worked hard on that every day until I was 20. So I did 8 years as a poet. And one of the reasons I stopped was that there was really no further road. In other words, no one would publish the things. Nobody liked them. And I was in University College Dublin, where there were other poets of my age already with books out, being praised for very good reasons. And the Irish Times would do a thing like, we're going to use a full page of poetry. We're going to and all of us would send in our poems, and all of them would get their poems in, and me would not. And this had to end at some point. I mean, a friend brought me aside and said, "When is this going to end?" And in Ireland as well, there were so many good poets. I mean, Paul Muldoon's first book came out during that period, and there were so many good poets that being a bad poet was a matter of some shame.
Can I interject? Were you a bad poet? Did you have it or did you not have it?
No, I didn't have it.
Okay.
No.
And when did you realize you did?
Well, I was a poet without a poem, except that I had poems, but they were not good. And what happened was that I went to live in Spain, and it was very exciting being there, and the poetry simply dropped away. And I think everybody was very relieved. But it was sad, because it's a mark. It's like being a failed priest. That you went slowly towards it, and then it didn't happen. So you didn't get to say Mass, like you didn't get your first book of poetry out. And the next thing I did was I did short stories. And short stories at that time, I'm talking about the 1970s into the 80s, were all the rage in Ireland. And people were talking about the Irish experience being particularly, I suppose, attached or matched with the form of the short story, which allows for disappointment, and that seemed, or solitude, or things not working out, or rain, or mist. It didn't do. So the short story didn't allow thunderstorms as much as almost thunderstorms. It became just mist. And I tried to do that. And I'm really not making this up. I wish I was. And
I think I remember Frank O'Connor. There's some collection that Frank O'Connor edited it, and that is the introduction.
Yes.
Only the Irishman truly understands.
And the Russians. And the Russians. Us and Russian serfs on the steppe, where nothing was possible, and something had almost been possible, and then didn't occur. And it's a Frank O'Connor book called The Lonely Boys. He was really the architect of this idea that somehow, despite Ulysses, despite Elizabeth Bowen, despite that the short story was our thing. Well, I couldn't write them. I tried very hard to write them. And no matter what I did, it didn't work. And again, I sent them everywhere. The constant sending. And I made jokes, like the rejection slips I had up on a wall for a while, because obviously this is what famous writers did years later. They showed, look how much rejection I got. But there were too many, and it was too sad and too humiliating. And so, I really did work at this, and it didn't happen. And then one day I had an idea for a novel, and I was about 25, and I saw it. And that became my first novel. And for the years then, for the next, I suppose, 25 years, the world was, for me, a poem-free zone and a short story-free zone. And then the other two things. But I suppose by working so much, by living in language, by spending my days revising and writing sentences, I wrote a novel called The Master about Henry James. It was a big book. It was bigger than the book you see. There were, I think, 20,000 words cut out of it. Slow words, small sentences. So I was watching all the time, living in it. And when it was over, I began at night to go upstairs with the line of a poem and start working on it. And I did the same one day. I was in a hotel room in Bucharest, trying to sell my melancholy wares to the people of Romania. And the opening image of a story, I mean, not the character, not the scene, not all the clunky bits that have to be the who, where, when, that have to be set out, but just an image. And that became, I think, the first short story. But I was in my 50s by that time.
And the stories that you'd written earlier didn't work out. I love this thing you said about it being a failed poet is like being a failed priest, because it is, to be a poet is kind of a vocation.
Yeah.
You can't just go through the motions. I mean, some priests might, but...
Some poets do too,
but those early stories that weren't working, and I assume you mean both that they were getting rejected, but you knew they weren't working.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. Looking back now, what do you think was missing from those things that what did you figure out how to do when you were in Romania?
I think what I found, and I wish I'd known it before, was that I couldn't write about my own generation. I had been to university. I lived in Spain. But I was essentially a sort of a clueless 25-year-old who probably drank too much, was bitter about certain things, and was, messed up. But look, trying to write about myself and my generation in Dublin, without any sense of what that would look like, in the sense that what I'm talking about is I understood what my parents' lives were like. I could see what had happened to that generation. I could work that out. But I couldn't work out what it was like to be me, coming out of university, and say trying to have a dinner party where, three friends would turn up so late and so drunk, the others would stay at the party being so drunk, or just unpleasant, or just without a fixed form of manners. I couldn't write that. And when I tried, it was awful, but I thought it was good. And so with the first novel, it was really about someone who'd been born into years my parents were born, and trying to see the thing with almost sort of sense of, not exactly epic or myth, but some sense of the years, all the 30, 40 years I'm writing about, having some importance, or at least being fixed in time. With the story I got, it was about, the image was simple. It was that it was a priest visiting somebody who's the age of my mother. And as he's talking to her, sort of silence settles down in the room. And the priest looks down and he pulls up one of his socks in that distracted way a priest can do. And then he looked at the other sock and thought, he should pull that up too. That was the opening. It still is the opening of a story called A Priest in the Family.
And is that
just that? He pulled one sock up and then pulled another.
Is that still... And yeah, instantly that image, that could sit somewhere in a novel, but a novel isn't going to pour out of that image, but a short story might. The stories in this book, is that generally your experience with them? They came to you sort of initially with a kind of inciting image?
Yeah. Okay. What about this? Hold on. Has everything I've been saying been inaudible up to now? Okay, I'm talking about the second inauguration of Trump. And I have a character who is undocumented in America. And my aim now becomes to get him out of America before Trump gets to speak on that Monday. And the problem is the guy has a daughter in America, and so going back to Ireland after 30 years will be very difficult because he will never be able to come into America again. And so that on the last day he's going to be in America, his daughter, who's 12, says to her mother, who hates her father, look, I want you and him to love each other for one day and bring your new husband along too. And all four of us were going to hike up above the Bay Area in your woods. And I'm writing this, I'm writing the second half of this story on the very day it's happening. I've never done this before. It's a funny magic. I get up really early, as do they. They have to meet in a parking lot. Will there be a parking space? I don't know yet. But they'll know at 9:45, so will I. I'll work that out. As they're walking, I have the day ahead of me. I have nothing else to do. I will stay up until very late. So I will work from, say, 7 in the morning until very late at night to get Paul out of America. But to get him to have this final hike, like the Moor's Last Sigh, on this day. And he has kept a lot of the cash he's earned in socks, so he has to open all the pairs of socks and take all the cash out and just get ready to go. But that the main thing for me is, for once I'm working in real time. I'm working in the sort of magic of my moment is the same as their moment. And on the Monday, just before Trump speaks, there's an Aer Lingus direct flight from San Francisco Airport to Dublin Airport, and he will be on that. But otherwise, the stories are set in a time that I can see completed, that doesn't really move into the present in any way very much.
I noticed that. Take this too. And so that makes you the only person who did something productive on that day, I think. I'm very impressed that you came up with a strategy for that, and kicking myself for not having done the same. I noticed that the stories. The title of the collection is The News from Dublin. And as you read, there's an obvious joke, which is that there is no news from Dublin when you get to the story called The News from Dublin. But also, it's a bit of a joke because not very much of the book takes place in Dublin at all. You've got 3 stories that in one way or another are set in or descend from Catalonia, this part of Spain where you lived as a young man. Then you have 3 stories that are set in the Ireland that you've been describing, which is, I think you called it your parents' Ireland, an Ireland that's accomplished and finished, where nothing is in progress. And then you have the 3 American stories that are set in the age of GPS and Uber and all of these things. Do you find it, writing about the current moment in those 3 stories, is it difficult, is part of the difficulty of that related to this sort of frictionlessness of like it's easier for characters to just, get whatever they want by pushing a button on a phone, or nobody gets lost, nobody can't reach each other? Does the technology itself introduce a difficulty to creating a drama out of it?
The problem is I don't really have any interest in the present. It's nice. I sort of live in it. It's like how a fish must feel about water. It isn't. What I'm interested in, I suppose, is ideas of confrontation that don't happen. I mean, for example, the title story is a simple matter, that streptomycin has become available. Somebody has tuberculosis. How do you get streptomycin? And is there a special way in Ireland, through political, I suppose, influence, to get it early? And this is a poor man going to Dublin for his brother to see if he can get this. This is something that's haunted me all my life, because my father's younger brother died of tuberculosis, and my father was involved in politics, and the minister, who was the Minister for Health, who had control of this, was a friend of my father's, or so it was believed. He had influence. And that journey my father took to Dublin to see if he could get it and come home with it, or come home with news of it, was actually, it was real, it was in my life. And it was something that was hardly ever talked about, it was in the air, that Uncle Phil had died, and that there was a way this mightn't have happened if the streptomycin had come. And so it was just a question of writing that down in a way, because it mattered so much to me, it was on my mind. Nothing in the present is in my mind like that. And the only thing was that there is a story set in the present, which is called Sleep. And it is about someone living in New York, clearly connected in some way to Columbia University, which I am, finding himself going home to Ireland because he needs to see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist in question is dead now, but he did read the story and he did say this was what happened. In other words, I went to look for somebody back to Ireland, to somebody for help. I couldn't manage a New York shrink. I just couldn't sit there in all seriousness and listen to the sort of same person who maybe had listened to Woody Allen once upon a time. I just couldn't do it. I'd have to say, I want to see exactly the names of all the people you've spoken to before. So I went back to Ireland. I flew back to do this very specially, and I thought he was going to put me through a long period of talk therapy or some rubbish, and I had to tell him how I felt and pay him not to speak while I spoke, which is a curious thing. And but he hypnotized me, and the hypnosis is described in the story, and that is precisely what occurred. So there's a pressing need to get this down. No one else knew. See, he didn't know what I was going through in the hypnosis, and when it was over, he told me not to tell him. I thought the whole point was I could pour out all my griefs to him. He said, he said, keep it to yourself, all that. That's for you to deal with. It's not for you to tell me, it's for you to deal with. Yeah, it's a lovely Irish thing. You can pent it and withhold it. And so I needed to write it down, because there was no one else ever going to listen to me if I didn't write it down. I mean, in other words, no one else knew this. And it was pretty complex how the hypnosis worked, and unexpected and very hard. So that it wasn't, I was interested in the present moment there as much as in getting things down that really mattered to me, and see if I could communicate them, if I could get them to matter to somebody else for the brief period where they might read the story.
So you've got the Five Bridges story is set in America, and then you have Sleep and Barton Springs are two sort of shorter pieces, almost like prose poems, that are set in America and are a little more contemporary. But as you said, the bulk of the novel, or the collection, takes place in the 20s, the 50s, the 60s, kind of Finnish time. In that context, I'm curious about what it is that keeps drawing you back to Catalonia as a subject, what it was like to be there as a young man, what took you there, and whether there's some sort of hidden subterranean affinity with the Irish experience that makes you feel like you can speak Catalan, as it were, as well as you speak Irish English.
I don't know if there's any affinity to Ireland as much as, again, it's personal. Again, I lived there, and I still go there every year. And along the way, there's a final story in the book which almost began as a joke. It's 100 pages long. It's called The Catalan Girls. And Henry James had a friend who wrote a wonderful novel about French Protestant youth. She was English, and everyone said to her, "How do you know so much about French Protestant youth?" He said, "Oh," she said, "you see, I was in a building in Paris, and I was coming down a stairway, and I looked in a doorway, and I saw, briefly, I had the glimpse, really, of some French Protestant youth. And so that's what I know. That's how I know so much about it." And I always thought this was the best. So I was in Barcelona. I was looking for a small studio apartment that was going to be cheap, and I was in a line to look at some apartments, and I was at this particular line. 3 women came who had the same hairdo, who finished one another's sentences, who had lived in Argentina, who were Catalans, who had come back to live in their 60s in Barcelona. I spoke to them maybe for 2 minutes, nothing more. That's all I found out about them. And out of that was 1988. 30 years later, I set down their story as I imagined it. How do you know so much about Argentine women? I met 3 of them once in a line for an apartment. And so it began almost as a funny exercise in how much detail, how much will I add about each of their lives. Why did they go to Argentina? Who did they go with? What did they do first? Where did they live the first time? What did each of them do with their lives? Why did they decide to come back? All of it from an imagined, use of very useful 2 minutes. And that's how that happened.
Does James say something like, he called it the germ, right?
Yes.
James calls it the germ.
He does.
Does he say something like that is less often talked about, which is like if you spend too long standing in that doorway, you'll lose this. Like he would.
He has a stuff about he loved half a story. And the turn of the screw, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he had supper with him. In January 1895, he had supper with the Archbishop of Canterbury, came home, wrote in his notebook, supper with the Archbishop of Canterbury, told me an interesting story. But it wasn't the story of the turn of the screw, it was the beginning of that story. There was 2 children, it was the governess, but it didn't have the full story. And then he writes, I hate a story, but I love the beginning or half a story. And there's another of the Catalan stories there it's one called Summer of 38. And it was, I went to see a Catalan historian who had written a sort of micro-history of a very small area in the Pyrenees in the Civil War, which is 36 to 39. And I went to see him to talk to him about his methodology. There's an inner nerd here, and I wanted to find out a methodology for micro-history. And he told me that he had invited a general to come back from Madrid who had been a fascist, a young soldier, and to tell him precisely in this town where there were no fascists, which had been in the Civil War, where exactly the bombardments happened from. And as they were walking into town, this is in the full years of democracy, maybe in the years, say, in the 1990s, I mean, so long after the Civil War, the general would have been 80. The general met a woman on the street who was shopping, the same age as he was, and they embraced one another and they knew one another well after all the years. And he asked the general, what was that about? And the general said, the fascists, we set up a sort of makeshift bar by the river at night. This town was not a battlefield. The war was going on up the valley. And we had parties at night. We played the guitar and we drank. And it was a wonderful time. And the girls of the town came down. And some of us had romances with them. What? This is the least known thing, in this war. And when the historians telling me this, my main aim is to get away from him really quickly, because I don't want any more. I don't want him to tell me a single thing more. And I wanted to almost say, I have to go. I'm really sorry, just my car. The parking is going to be, I'm going to get a ticket. And from that, I wrote the story, Summer of 38.
I think there's a thing about James like telling people down the dinner table, like, shut up, stop telling the story right there. I've got everything I need. I don't want you to talk anymore. So screw it up. You mentioned the story Summer of 38. I selfishly always like to hear a bit of the work in the writer's voice, and there's an extraordinary 3 paragraphs in this story that I think might convey better than this conversation ever could part of the magic of these stories, which is not the germ itself, but what you get from the germ. In this story, you have decided that out of one of these, illicit summer romances between the local girls, and the phalangists who are sitting up in the hills, that a pregnancy will eventuate, because that's what you do as a novelist. When in doubt, it should lead to a pregnancy. And then the phalangists leave, and she has to find someone to marry quickly before it's discovered that she's pregnant, so that she'll have a legitimate birth, or so it seems. So she finds someone. Her name's Rosa, and she finds this guy, Paco. It's kind of uninteresting. You tell us a little bit about Paco, and then if you could just read these 3 paragraphs, starting here and here.
Really?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes.
She finds there's a fellow in the village or in the town who's been annoying her for the last few years at dances, and he's always wanting to dance with her and talk to her, and she just can't bear him. Her sisters can't bear him. And he works for the hydroelectric company. He's always talking about levels of water and levers, and he just wants to go away, Paco. And she realizes the only person who can now rescue her is going to be Paco. What is this? The problem I have now is she does marry Paco. And what do you do then? You make the minute they went home together, she couldn't bear him even more. As he approached her in bed, it made her sick, physically vomit. The way people are always saying, physically vomit. And when the baby was born, then Paco hated the baby because it wasn't his. You can't do that. So, but you present yourself with a problem. How tender is this relationship going to be? It wasn't merely a marriage of convenience. Paco was all for the marriage. So his enthusiasm could drive her crazy. And her mother says to her, it's fine you've married Paco, I'm glad you've got out of your fix, but don't bring him around here too much because we're already weary of him. But what is going to happen what am I going to do with him now? The child is called Rosa, the daughter. As soon as Rosa was born, Paco wanted to hold her. In the days that followed, Marta, who's the mother, watched him to see if he was holding the baby merely for her sake. She saw no sign of that, however. When Paco came home from work, he wanted to know what the baby had been doing. Even being told that she had been sleeping was enough for him. As they walked through the town with the baby, Marta was aware that other men were laughing at Paco because of his devotion to the baby. She knew that her family laughed at him, too. But Paco remained impervious to the laughter. When he was at home, he tried to amuse the baby. He soothed her if she cried. And once Rosa learned to walk, Paco loved taking her out, moving as slowly as she wanted and holding her hand with pride. Being married to him was strange. He never once asked her about the father of the child. He seemed grateful and content with everything. Martha was grateful to him in return, but that did not keep her from feeling relieved when he left for work each day or when he fell asleep beside her in the bed. She was careful to disguise this, though. And then, as they had 2 more daughters and moved to a bigger apartment, she found that being polite to him took on a force of its own. She tolerated him and then grew fond of him. In time, as she realized that her parents and her sisters were still laughing at her, she saw less of them. She began to feel a loyalty towards Paco, a loyalty that lasted for all the years of their marriage. Rosa did not look like Marta or Paco or her 2 sisters, nor, Marta thought, did she resemble Rudolfo, who's the fascist. All she had of her natural father was her way of staying apart. She had little interest in the company of other girls, and yet everyone liked her. Although Paco was proud of his 2 other daughters, it was always clear that he loved Rosa best.
Did you hear there was an awe? But to get from, the little germ of, we set up a platform down by the river, and, the boys would come down on the hills and would have dances at night, and they embraced on the street, to, was that 2 decades, kind of in the space of 3 paragraphs, and transformative decades in the lives of these 3 characters is really kind of emblematic of how each of these stories works, I think. So I want to return to your assertion that no one does cartwheels when you write a story. The short story is unloved. What do you love about shorts? I think that's wrong, because I also hear everyone walking around saying they have no time to read or no attention to read, or I can only read for 15 minutes in bed at night before I fall asleep. And it all sounds perfect for a short story. You think, well, don't read a novel, just read a short story before you fall asleep. What do you love as a reader about short stories?
I suppose the initial investment as a reader you put into a work of prose fiction, that you really have to get involved with these characters, and you want that to happen. And you're all ready for it. And if a short story works for you, you're all ready for it. If it was a novel, you could have another week with it. If it was a short story, it could just turn the page and it could be just over. And I think that's horrible. I suppose if you were asked what's the difference between a novel and a short story, it would be that Thomas Hardy's, say, The Mayor of Casterbridge is a novel. In other words, it begins with a man and his wife and their daughter coming into a country town in England where there's a fair or an auction. And by the end of the evening, he has got drunk, the man, and he's put his wife up for auction. Who will buy this woman? And a dark stranger over there says, I'll buy her. And that evening, the dark stranger, the wife and the daughter walk out of the town, leaving the drunken husband behind. Now, no matter what you do, that's going to have consequences. And the novel will be the terms of its consequences set out with, there will be plausible but unexpected, but those characters something will have to result from what has occurred that day, and it will have to result over time. But if you were rewriting that as a short story, it would be that the man, his wife, his daughter come into the country town, they see the fair, and for a second, the man could have an ugly thought. I'd like to sell the 2 of those and get rid of them. Just a thought, just going through his mind for a second. And whatever happens in the air, she sees it or feels it, the wife. She gets a sense of his apartness from them. But there's more than that, something more than that. Just gets a sense of it. It's there in something he does or some way he looks. And they walk back to the lodging place where they're staying. They make sure the daughter has somewhere comfortable to sleep, and they go into the bedroom. And she just, as she's pulling the curtains, just that thought occurs to her, that maybe that's the most important thing about their lives, what she saw that afternoon, but nothing more than that. And then they go to sleep. And they turn the pages. There's another story. And, so it's that, that's a complete difference. And working on the second one then depends always on something small that occurs in 1 second, where things turn, things hinge. It's like the air, it's like a change in the air and the light. And you can't overdo it. The reader must be not quite sure exactly where it occurs.
I love that you picked Mayor of Casterbridge, because that setup, which is one of those preposterous, I think my lavalier works, one of those preposterous setups in all of our literature. If you spend any time working in the salt mines of the short story, you just know that would never work as a short story. My students are always trying to write that short story, kind of, and you're going like, this just wants to be a novel. I can't explain it, but it's just like too big, as you said. And the novel would be the consequences of the action. The story is just the consequences of the thought.
But I just want to say one more thing. Can I say one more thing?
You can say many things as you like.
I lived in Barcelona first between 1975 and 1978. When I left in 1978, most people I know did not have telephone. I mean, they were going to move apartment. They had no fixed telephone number. They were there forever. They obviously had no email. There was no way of finding people. So I didn't go back for about 10 years. And then I started to go back quite a lot.
And then one day, I would think maybe sometime just say 2000 and something, meaning more or less 30 years after I'd left. I was in a bar at Bar del P in Place del P. I was looking at the poster of a group show of painters. Just my eyes were just wandering down the names when I saw a name on that list of someone I had not seen for 30 years and I had been very close to. I could describe him in very great detail. And a lot of people who were in that world that I was in those years, in the 1970s, they died of AIDS or they died of heroin. And suddenly here he was, his name, there couldn't be anyone else's name. And it meant that I could then leave a note at the gallery and then I could start seeing him again after 30 years. And of course, I suppose we had changed, but not that much. I mean, obviously I'm bald and everything, but so that's what gets in really to that story, is the idea that after all those years, somebody who you thought you'd never see again appears like that. And so that was really in other words, everything has a root in something strange that's going on in your mind that you've no way to resolve. And you find a metaphor, you find a bigger story or a better story to describe what is quite a pressing set of emotions.
I wanted to circle back to this story that you mentioned earlier called A Free Man, which is one of my favorites in the collection. And I'm partly thinking about circling back because I see Joyce Carol Oates in the front row and she's listening to us about Mary Pastor-Ridge, and I'm thinking about all of her short stories and I'm thinking, I bet she's got a short story like that somewhere. Like she's gone for it all the way and pulled it off. So there's a specific kind of short story that's about the consequences of the thought. And it's a particular subset of the short story. But this story, A Free Man, has, like the Catalan Girls and like The Summer of 38, has a novel's worth of situation in it. And the situation is, and I was thinking about how to put this. My father married my mother when she was 19, and he was her professor, and she was his student, or had just ceased being his student. And at the time, nobody batted an eyelash. Everybody came to the wedding. In this story, you have a young man who's a teacher, and he's not teaching college, I think he's teaching high school. And we never quite learn, it's not coy, but it doesn't really matter for the story exactly how much he's transgressed the line of consent with his students. There's been some transgression, and it's been treated as a crime. We're picking up many years later as he leaves prison. But the way that you've constructed the story is the emphasis isn't on the kind of, ins and outs of the crime or the suspense. It's him, years later, trying to figure out where to live, getting out of jail, and thinking back on this. And it's a story that, in any other genre, it pushes toward melodrama, toward a certain kind of judgment. And in the context of the short story, it's more about curiosity. And it's a very uncomfortable read, but you don't walk out of the story. You walk out of the story closer to the character. That's part of the discomfort. How did you come to write this story?
I just, again, go back to things that when I was teaching that time in Barcelona, somebody came to teach in the school who, it was unlikely that he would come, and he was older, he was in his 40s, and eventually I found out that he had served a prison sentence for embezzlement, and that he had come more or less directly from prison because a friend of his was one of the directors of the school. And I remember being really shocked at how little we know about each other, that I could have spent, including I spent time on my own drinking with him and going to restaurants, going to bars, and he didn't mention it, and I didn't know it. And I thought, I imagine what that would be like, coming into Barcelona as a refuge after prison. And then, of course, in Ireland, the whole business of sex abuse from teachers, from priests, from parents, that all that emerged as a huge highlight in the society. I mean, there was nothing else in the newspapers for a very long time. And it included the fact that there was a prison, which is quite near the centre of Dublin, where all of the sex abusers go. The ordinary decent criminals don't want sex abusers in the main Irish prisons. They won't tolerate them. So they have to be put in another prison. Many of them are priests. And it just occurred to me one day, I wonder if a Jesuit arrived among them, what that would be like for them to have a Jesuit. And those sort of thoughts are really helpful, because this is a guy who was a seminarian, was going to be a priest. So he has a connection to the church, and suddenly he's with all these Christian brothers and all these priests, and there is finally a Jesuit. But when he gets out, he goes to Barcelona, and he has to find somewhere to live. He has to find, how do you open a bank account? He's the guy looking for the bicycle, because of course, if he's on a bicycle, his face is known because there was a controversy about his release. So if an Irish tourist sees him on the street, they will take photographs of him, they will follow. And so that's why he wants the bike. And my job was merely to embed myself in his mind, to live in his experience, to get as much detail into that experience as possible. How do you open a bank account in Barcelona? How long do you have to wait? And the problem is, he's living in a state of suppressed rage because of his prison sentence, and he's ready not to go into a rage in the bank against the bank clerk, because his account still can't be opened. Just the daily business of, should he go to the beach? How do you, just embed.
And so I think what I mean is, I hear you talking, I can imagine a novel that's set in the prison, right? Like, Catherine Porter's Ship of Fools. Like, isn't this interesting to be surrounded by all these sex criminals who are priests in this prison? But the way that the story is instead of with one of them trying to get a city bike in Barcelona, and that invites sympathy. Who hasn't had some annoying experience with, setting something up technologically, much less in Barcelona, where they make everything impossible. And so if I said to you, one of the best stories in this book invites you to spend, 30 pages with a sex predator, you wouldn't run out and buy the book. But to me, it's one of the best things in the book. I'm just wondering, what is the value of embedding, to use your word, in the context of a short story with a character? What does the short story reveal that, the novel set in the prison can't? What's the value of being? What's the value of sympathizing with this guy?
I'm not sure that there's any moral value in anything, actually, but at all. But the difference here between a novel and a story, I don't want to go into the detail of what he did as an abuser. I just don't want to write it down. I just the idea, the icky business of it, and I'm trying to keep the reader embedded in his mind, but he can't. His mind doesn't handle at all the fact of the detail of what he did. Mm-hmm. He has put that out of his mind. He had to listen to it as a victim statement in court, but it isn't his. It's a daily thing that he keeps away. So therefore, I don't want to do it. In a novel, it would have to be there. It would have to be there in all the detail. It would have to be, what were his motives the first day? What did it feel like when he almost did it one day, and then the next day? And he's a maths teacher, so he's in great demand. People really need him. He's giving lessons at home to these kids, and they desperately need him because they're going to fail otherwise. So he has them on his own in a room, and they can't complain. Now, if I have to go into all this motive, all this detail, it's just, I can get much more from him alone years later, not dealing with this, not facing this. And the story hinges on a moment where there's only one friend he has in the city. And the friend eventually says to him one night, how did it feel? I mean, do you regret it? And he just says, I regret being caught. And he didn't mean to say that. He didn't. That's not what he meant to say. But he found himself saying it. And his friend was taken aback by the directness of it. And he too was taken aback by the fact that he just said something that he clearly means but didn't want to say. And so I'm working around, I suppose, areas of denial, of guilt, of withholding, of silences, and they can fit into that form in a way that in the novel I just would feel. Also, it would be such a waste of 2 or 3 years dealing with this fellow and his pedo activities.
Let's see, I think you were saying I could get so much more out of it, and I was going to say so much more of what, but the answer is so much more of how it feels to be this guy. And it just struck me when I was reading that the story sort of refuses to judge him because it's pointless to judge him. I mean, we know what the judgment is. You know, that's not the interesting question. You know, the interesting question in the story isn't, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? The interesting question in the story is, how does it feel to be such a person? And, you know, we spend all our time out here in judgment land just, you know, kind of refusing to make those leaps. And the story, all of these stories, the boy who, you know, steals all the money, this book is populated with people doing kind of terrible things, very thoughtfully. But the invitation isn't, you know, to tune in just long enough to figure out whether they're good or bad people. You know, the invitation is to come along and feel it with them. And for me, it's uncomfortable. You know, I keep going like, I'm taking that money. It's sitting right there. So what do you think about the role of judgment and compassion in this? I mean, you said there's nothing moral in them or possibly at all, but what do you think about the role of judgment and compassion?
I think it may be that it's not that we have a duty to imagine the damned, but that I just said we have a duty to imagine the damned. That seems very highfalutin to me. We don't have any duty, and the damned is a stupid word, but that it is necessary sometimes, if you're writing a story, to go into an area in your imagination that might not make you comfortable or the reader, but that is, if you don't do that, then you're writing sweet apple pie, you know, or you could progress very easily into creating sweet images all the time. Images of, I mean, I notice that people want hope. Well, I don't want hope. I mean, if I want hope, I'll get it myself, but I don't want a writer to feel they have to artificially offer me hope. Maybe an advertiser I want that in, but not a novelist. In other words, you have to go into dark places, but don't overdo praising yourself for that. It's just another thing you have to do.
I wonder if we'd have some time for any questions from the audience.
The way that you write about women just blows me away. I just don't know any other writer that captures a woman the way that you do. So maybe my question is, how do you do that?
I think I'm talking about 3 or 4 very particular people. My Auntie May, my Auntie Harriet, my Auntie Cathy, and my mother. In other words, that in our house, my mother had 2 younger sisters who didn't marry until later, and they would just come into town, and they would just open the door. I mean, they wouldn't have to knock the door. And my Auntie Cathy, my father's sister, never married, and I was her favourite. And they were always interesting on every matter, and they mainly talked about clothes and fashion. But that was just a way of guiding them, not talking about other things that he needed to talk about more. You know, on a Sunday, you could go up to my parents' bedroom and find out that they were all there. And my 2 sisters would be there and some other people. And they would all be talking about some coat that my Auntie Harriet had nearly bought in Dublin, a green coat. And Harriet would say, describe the coat, and the buttons were lovely. But she just didn't buy it. She didn't know why she didn't buy it. And she's thinking about it ever since. And my mother would say, Harriet, green doesn't suit you. And that would be epic. That would be something had happened, an enormous tear in our civilization, you know, something enormous and unnecessary. Afterwards, they would talk about, wasn't your mother awful what she said to Harriet about her coat? But she didn't buy the coat. I know, but just, and then Harriet would say, well, Rita, my cardigan I'm wearing now is green. I was say, yes, it doesn't suit you. And honestly, this would never be forgotten by anyone in that room. And it's so much so that I would be put out for just listening too much. Can't get out. And I would go downstairs to find my father and my uncle and my brothers, and they'd all be sitting there talking about some goal that someone nearly scored. You know, it'd be so boring. It would be that 3rd goal that young O'Neill scored. I thought that would have been a good goal if he had scored it. And, you know, to Beckett as a social realist, And my father would say, yeah, but there was nearly another goal later. So, this is the most tedious, this is the most tedious thing that's ever happened. I must get out of this room now. And they always seemed, and you try to get back upstairs and they wouldn't let you in. Now that business of sitting outside the room, not being let in, is the making of a novelist. In other words, that if only I could be in there, I could be satisfied. What I have to do now is feel grievance and imagine what the next thing they could be talking about now. Auntie Maeve could say that she found that there was a new nail varnish which was better for ladders for stockings than the old one she'd been using. What did anyone think? And then there was some woman who went up the cathedral in the middle aisle with a ladder down the back of her stocking, did no one tell her. And it would just go on and on. And it is, to this day, the most interesting thing that I've ever witnessed. And it's nothing to do with women, it's to do with those conversations, those women. And so when I wrote the novel Brooklyn, it was imagining that Harriet had gone to America. In Nora Webster, that's my mother. In all those books, it's just them. It's nothing. Oh, the Virgin Mary was my mother going on about, I never liked weddings. My mother didn't like weddings. Yeah, but love talking like that, and talking about my friends as being, only children. I find only children are such a nuisance. Like something like that. Why? But I gave that to the Virgin Mary. She didn't like it. She had problems with only children. I had my mother imagining that I was going to be crucified, which is very far-fetched, but it's how the imagination works. And so it's nothing. I'm sorry, I wish I knew something enormous I could tell you about gender and about women and about men, but I just was in that room.
So what is your process? Is that like, really, what is your process?
I suppose I write in longhand in a notebook. I leave the left-hand page blank. It's A4 size, so if I need to make any revisions. But the aim is to make no revisions. The aim is to see if you could work as though you'll never get another chance. And so this is it. And you do this right now, because there's no chance you're going to get to revise this or rewrite it. It doesn't mean you don't revise it or rewrite it, but it means that the first time you're working it has to attempt to be definitive. After that, nothing. After that, you just write down one thing and then you write down another. And I don't know is the second answer. That it's just trying to make it seem natural. But I don't know what that means either. So it's just a question of getting into a corner, looking down, getting your pen, and going at it. And I suppose, I don't know. I think if you thought too much about it, you might become all self-conscious and do areas of self-parody. I feel I write too many short little sentences. And I try and vary that then to see if, have a sentence beginning, notwithstanding. Notwithstanding, but I can't do that. There's so many words I can't use. And notwithstanding is one of them.
Insofar.
Moreover, insofar as that you just stuck to, she went across the room, she looked out the window, she saw nothing much, she crossed the room again, thought she might have tea, but then thought she wouldn't. And you go, stop writing like that, you got to give that up. And so, yes, there's a lot of efforts to reform and write maybe longer sentences. And there's a Hungarian writer called Laszlo Krasznahorkai, and he writes big long novels with only one big long sentence, and I wish I could do that.
Thank you. I'm coming back to what you were speaking about at the end. You mentioned something about these stories about, let's say, a pedophile, and that you're not here to give hope, or a writer isn't always here to give hope. And I find these stories where we go inside of the mind of someone who maybe we would call evil or bad, to emphasize the fact that there is no such thing as an evil person. We're all sort of capable of any of these things, what we see happening in the world right now, these people. And so I guess my question to you is that not hope?
I think Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, has a really good description of what it means in a time of conflict, when you could be asked to take sides, to what a well-made poem might mean. And he said that it's an example using language of something properly done, something decently done. And it involves restraint, control, and the creation of I suppose, something larger than that, from that material. And that might mean something in a place where none of that's available in the political realm or in the public realm. In the meantime, Thomas Mann has an amazing essay called Brother Hitler, where he tries to see Hitler not as a person apart from ordinary Germans, or indeed himself, Thomas Mann, but as having aspects of him. And everyone wants to know about Trump, like, what's Trump really like? What does he mean? I was thinking this morning, because somebody asked me to write something about this, that there is a joke. We have this idea that we vote for people not because we like them, but because we think they might like us. And if you think about that, like, I think Obama would like me if he met me, but Hillary Clinton, I'm not sure she'd really approve of me. And so she would deplore. She'd deplore. Like, everyone can have a different view on who would like them. But I thought I would really like to tell Trump a joke. I would really like to be sitting beside him and say, hey, there's something I mean to tell you. And he would say, what? And I would say, look, the man, I was thinking that if the waiter came over to you and asked you, you were ordering dinner, and he said, what about the vegetables? You could say, oh, they can order whatever they like. And they would include the following, and he would think this was funny because that's how he thinks about Pete Hesketh and all those other people around him, poor JD. The vegetables can order whatever they want. And I thought of telling Trump this joke, and that Trump would appreciate this joke. What have I come to? That on a beautiful Saturday morning in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, with all the things I could do, the Metropolitan Museum, MoMA, the Frick, for God's sake, I could be looking at the beautiful painting by Holbein in the Frick. I could be looking, just think of the options. I could be going to Central Park, I could be jogging, I could be looking at other people. And I'm having that thought. What has happened to my mind that has been invaded in that way? Like, it isn't just thinking about him, thinking about talking to him, thinking about getting his approval, thinking about telling him a joke that he would think was funny, we both would think were funny. Like, this has gone very far.
And I want to thank our two authors.
Thank you, Colm and Garth, for sharing this conversation with us. Thank you to the Montclair Literary Festival for hosting them, and to all the folks who came out to the festival this year. Listeners, you can find copies of the news from Dublin in store and a link to all the books they discussed in our show notes and on our website.
Tomorrow, Wednesday, June 3rd, in partnership with Out Montclair, we welcome Moth storyteller Phil Branch to celebrate his memoir, Double Dutch Fuss. And on Wednesday, June 17th, we host Justin Baer, author of House of Fidelity. It's a deep dive into one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world.
Don't forget to come by this weekend for our New Jersey bookstore crawl, sponsored by New Jersey Collective. We'll have some sale items, some books and merchandise at 20% off.
You can get details and tickets for all of our events, story times, and book clubs through our newsletter, show notes, or at watchyoungbooksellers.com.
The Watch Young Booksellers podcast is produced by Catherine Council and Marnie Jessup, and it's recorded at Watch Young Booksellers in Montclair, New Jersey. The show is edited by Catherine Council, and original music is composed and performed by Violet Muika. Research and show notes by Caroline Chertleff. Thank you to the staff at Watch Young Booksellers and the Kids Room for all their hard work and love of books.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, follow, and share it. You can follow us on social media at Watch Young Booksellers. And if you have any questions or ideas, you can reach us at wbpodcast@watchyoungbooksellers.com.
We'll see you next time. Until then, for the love of books, keep reading.